In 1540, Hernando de Soto explored what is nowadays Georgia in hopes of finding gold. Later, in 1565, the Spanish began to settle Florida. They hoped that one day they would rule Georgia, so they named the area Guel. Soon, in 1566, the Spanish began to settle and build forts in Guel. Although they dreamed to rule it, they did very little to the land. By 1670, England had ruled the 12 colonies. The only one they didn't have was Guel. However, by 1690, all the Spanish had left Guel. It lay unoccupied between Spanish Florida and England's 12 colonies. England wanted to rule this land. In about 1729, James Oglethorpe came along. He believed that people who have felonies should be able to start over in Guel. They went to the King George to grant them access to Guel. In 1732, the king made Georgia. It was now officially the 13th American colony. There were 21 trustees of Georgia. Among them was James Oglethorpe, soon to be Georgia's first governor. After that, it was soon decided that Georgia would not only be for debtors and felonies, that other people would move there too. And unlike the other colonies, Georgia would have no slavery. In 1773, James Oglethorpe wanted to settle the Yamacraft Bluff by the Savannah River to be Georgia's first town. However, the Yamacraft tribe already lived there. They kindly said there was room for them. This land became known as Savannah. From 1739 to 1744, England and Spain fought over the colonies. On July 7, 1742, James Oglethorpe's army defeated the Spanish at the Battle of the Bloody Marsh. They defeated the Spanish so bad they say the ground turned red with Spanish blood. This is how England kept Georgia. Back then, Georgia was a very small growing state because of its ban on slavery. In 1743, James Oglethorpe left for good. Now that he was gone, there was nothing holding slavery back. In 1750, the trustees granted a law allowing slavery. Thousands of new people now moved to Georgia to make it their new home. Shortly after this, the trustees gave Georgia up to the king. During the French and Indian War, England borrowed so much money they got into huge debt. They believed that the Americans should help pay for this. In 1776, July 4th, the American leaders made the Declaration of Independence, declaring their independence against England. At first, Georgia didn't have a big part in this war. Then the British captured Savannah. By 1780, the British had captured all of Georgia except for a small part by Augusta. Then, in the fall of 1781, the Americans won the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. General Mad Anthony Wayne was sent to help get Georgia back. In June 1782, General Wayne and his army defeated the British and the Indians fighting alongside them. That was the last battle of the Revolutionary War. And finally, in 1788, Georgia became the fourth state. After Georgia became a state, a man named Eli Whitney moved there. And by spring of 1793, he had made a machine that could clean cotton gin, called the cotton gin, 50 times as faster as a person could by hand. This made Georgia the world's most successful cotton grower. Later, in the 1820s, the Cherokee tribe made the famous Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. They hoped this would mean they'd have a home in northern Georgia and forever. However, in 1827, gold was found on their land. Soon there was a gold rush in Georgia, and in the 1830s, they were forced out of Georgia and into Oklahoma. The survivors called the route the Trail of Tears. In the mid-1800s, the North and the South were arguing over slavery. The North wanted to end slavery, so Georgia and 10 other states separated from the rest of the country. They formed a group called the Confederacy. The government said that they couldn't separate. War between the Union and the Confederates struck out, creating the Civil War. The Confederates didn't have enough money or supplies to win the war, so at the end, things turned the worst for Georgia. In 1864, General William Sherman and his troops attacked Georgia on their way to the sea. They burned everything from plantations to farms and ripped up railroad tracks. Later that year, in December, they captured Savannah. In 1865, the Confederacy lost the war. 25,000 Georgians died during it, and along with that, Georgia looked like it had been struck by a tornado. Later, in 1870, Georgia had became part of the Union again. Without slavery, Georgia made less money on cotton, and in the 1920s, beetles wrecked the cotton crop. they started to grow peaches and peanuts. Still, even in the 1930s, people didn't think that blacks were their equals. They started to separate the two groups. They wouldn't allow blacks and whites to go to the same school. They wouldn't even allow them the freedom to vote. To make things even worse for the blacks, a terrorist group called the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, had been in Georgia since slaves got their freedom. They went around setting fire to their houses, beating them up, and sometimes even hanging them. Soon the blacks couldn't stand any longer and started to fight for their freedom. One of the biggest leaders was Martin Luther King. He led the African Americans, and by the 1970s, they had equal rights. Sadly, he was assassinated. However, now Georgia is a thriving state. Georgia's weather is similar to Idaho's, but much warmer and humid. In the winter, it has a span of the high 40s to the low 60s. Georgia's springs are cool, crisp, and warm, like May and Idaho, and it is perfect t-shirt weather. Spring is the best time to visit Georgia. Summers in Georgia aren't very pleasant because of the hot weather. Even though the average day doesn't go past the mid-90s, it's humid, so it makes it feel a lot hotter. Fall is like spring, but slightly chillier. It's great weather for a light sweater, and you never get overheated or too cold. All around, fall is a great time to visit Georgia. One of the reasons Georgia is such a great state to visit is because it has lots of different landforms and many historical landmarks. Here are some of the best places to visit in Georgia. Number 1, Atlanta. Atlanta is Georgia's state capital. It is the biggest city in the state, so it has lots to see, from beautiful dogwood trees to the capital's Golden Dome. However, one of the most important sites to see in history is at 501 Auburn Street. You can see where Martin Luther King grew up, and right next to it is a church where his grave is. Number 2, Stone Mountain. In northern Georgia, there is the world's largest sculpture of 3 Confederate heroes of the South: Jefferson Davis, General Robert E. Lee, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and these are the Confederate hero people. Just to give you an idea of how big it is, 30 people ate lunch on General Lee's shoulder. Dahlonega Museum. In the Dahlonega Mountains, there is a museum about the gold rush of the 1800s. You can also explore the city. Many of the tourists go there to pan for gold. It is an amazing sight. 4, Brasstown Bald Mountain. Brasstown Bald Mountain is one of Georgia's highest peaks. It has everything from forests to rushing rivers. From the top of the mountain, you can see Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and obviously Georgia. 5, Okefenokee Swamp. The Okefenokee Swamp is a swamp in southern Georgia. It is a great place to visit because it has crocodiles and plants and animals that you wouldn't usually see. Georgia is one of the biggest states in America and has one of the biggest cities to go along with it, Atlanta. One of the coolest things about Georgia is that it has many huge companies that many people use, such as Coca-Cola, the soft drink, UPS, the postal service, Home Depot, the hardware store, and finally Delta, one of the most popular airlines. All of these companies started right here in Georgia. Georgia has many different climates and many plants and animals, so there are lots of things that represent it. Here are their top 8 symbols. Number 1, state flower, Cherokee rose. Number 2, state bird, brown thrasher. Number 3, state tree, live oak. Number 4, state butterfly, tiger swallowtail. Number 5, state fossil, shark tooth. Number 6, state gem, quartz. Number 7, fish, largemouth bass. And finally, the most well-known thing about Georgia, state fruit, peach. Georgia is one of the most interesting states of all time. They have everything from historical sites to your favorite food. Here are 3 of the most interesting things about Georgia. 1, they held the Olympics in 1996. 2, they have the world's largest airport. And number 3, Georgia has 159 counties because when they were first making the counties, they measured them by how far you could ride by a horse in one day. Georgia is one of the greatest states in America. They have everything from historical sites to high peaks. It is a great and fun place to visit or live. Come to visit Georgia now. Drop the mic.